Curves have a way of making you feel like you don't really know how to sew. They're easy to mess up and they make an otherwise simple project feel advanced. But curves aren't as complicated as they seem, and you don't need talent. This is a skill you can learn and take with you into future practical sewing projects. Hi, I'm Victoria, and I help you sew practical, stylish accessories that are ready for real life and real adventures. In this video, I'm breaking down curves into something you can actually understand and use. As part of that, we'll look at what sewing a curve really is, the core controls behind it, and the process I use to get smooth curves in practical sewing. We'll also cover what to do with different levels of curves, why some don't behave even when you sew them well, and the common mistakes that make curves feel harder than they are. One of the reasons curves feel confusing is because we talk about it like the machine is sewing a curve. But a sewing machine can't actually do that. It only ever sews straight stitches. What makes a curve is the fact that the fabric is slowly turning while those straight stitches are happening. So a curve is really just a lot of tiny straight stitches placed in slightly different directions. And once you see that, curves stop being mysterious and they become something that you can control. Now, before we look at exactly how to sew a curve, let's look at some core controls that make curves work. When you strip it down, sewing curves is really about control. And there are 3 things you're always controlling when you sew a curve. The first is speed. Curves almost always go better when the machine is slowed way down, because time is what allows you to make small adjustments. The second is how fabric moves. You're not just feeding it forward. You're guiding it, turning it gradually as it goes under the needle.
Goes under the needle?
Yikes, that sounds dramatic. And the third is what you're looking at. With curves, you're not lining up the fabric along a straight line. You're repeatedly bringing one spot of the fabric back to the same visual reference point as the curve shifts. Those 3 controls, speed, guidance, and visual alignment, are what actually create a smooth curve. Now, with those 3 things in mind, let's head to the machine and I'll show you how I actually sew a curve. Most people only ever buy bias tape, and that's totally fine. But you can make your own, and it's way more flexible than store-bought. When you make it yourself, you're not stuck with solid colors that almost match. You can use any fabric, make as much as you want, and it's usually softer and easier to work around curves. The problem is, once you do that, no one really tells you what to do with it. It doesn't come neatly wrapped on cardboard, and it very quickly turns into a tangled drawer situation. That's why I made my bias tape storage cards. They're sturdy, laminated chipboard, not flimsy cardstock. Each set comes with 6 cards and 6 clips, and you can hang them, stack them, and even stand them up like mini fabric bolts. They give you a clean way to wrap and store the bias tape or piping that you already took the time to make, so it stays neat, visible, and actually usable next time. If you make your own bias tape, or you think you might someday, they're available in my shop on my website. I'll have it linked below if you want to check them out. All right, back to the video. Now for this demonstration, I'm just using a scrap piece of fabric with a gentle curve, similar to the kind of curve I might use on something like a pouch top or flap. Nothing precise here, this is just to practice the motion. And I'm not sewing it to anything right now, I'm just focusing on the stitching itself. Now before I even start sewing, I want to pick a visual reference point on my machine. This is the point that I'm going to keep bringing the fabric back to as the curve turns. For example, I want my stitching pretty close to the edge. So I'm using the first narrow slot in the needle plate just to the right of the needle, and I'm lining up the fabric with the left edge of that slot. Now, what you choose as your reference point will depend on your seam allowance and what you're making. The important part is just having a consistent point to guide the curve forward. Now I'm going to slow my machine way down. My machine has speed control, so I'm setting it to the lowest setting. That way, even if I press hard on the pedal, it won't let the machine take off. If your machine doesn't have speed control, you can still do this. Just focus on pressing very lightly on the foot pedal and keeping the speed slow and steady. Now I'm going to lower the presser foot and do the first stitch. And when you're sewing curves, it's really helpful to think of it in terms of 1 stitch at a time. 1 stitch, then tiny adjustment, The next stitch, another tiny adjustment. You're not steering the fabric in big measurements. You're making very small turns between stitches. As I'm sewing the fabric, I'm gently guiding the fabric. I'm not pushing it forward. The machine is still doing the work of pulling it through. My hand is there to steady it, slow it down a little, and turn it gradually, not to force it. I like to actually rest my hand on the fabric and on the machine instead of just gently touching it with my fingertips. That little bit of contact gives you more control and keeps the fabric from running ahead of you. Most of my focus is on the visual reference point. I'm watching the spot where the fabric is lining up with the machine. At the same time, I'm aware of where the needle is landing. Not watching it go up and down, but watching where each stitch is forming in relation to that reference. So after each stitch, I'm making a tiny turn based on what I just saw, bringing the fabric back so the next stitch stays on the curve. And this is really what sewing a curve looks like. Stitch, tiny turn, stitch, tiny turn. And if this feels overwhelming at first, you can absolutely use the hand wheel and take it one stitch at a time until your hand gets used to the movement. And you just keep doing that. Slow, small movements, guiding your fabric back to the reference point until you reach the end of the curve. That's the basic process. The basic process stays the same for any curve. What changes is how often you adjust and how slow you need to go. So next, let's talk about how different curves change what you do. I like to think about curves as a spectrum. On the one end, you have gentle curves. These don't need much turning. You can usually sew them fairly smoothly with small, occasional adjustments. In the middle, you have medium curves. Here, you are turning more often, slowing down more, and paying closer attention to where each stitch is landing. And on the other end, you have tight curves. This is where curves really start to demand control. As curves get tighter, three things increase. You go slower, you make micro turns more often, and sometimes you pause completely to adjust. With tight curves, it can really help to stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot, make a tiny turn, put the foot back down, and then do the next stitch. That way, you're not trying to turn and stitch at the same time. You're giving yourself a moment to reset the fabric before moving forward. But for the most part, it's the same process. Next, let's look at some common mistakes. Now, before we move on to other things to consider, I want to quickly call out a few common mistakes. I'm not going to spend long on these. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory, but having them in your head can save you a lot of frustration. The first mistake is sewing too fast. If the machine is moving too quickly, you won't really have the space to see what's happening or make small adjustments. It's easier for it to get away from you and accidentally sew over the edge. The second is trying to rotate the fabric too much at once. Big turns create sharp angles. Curves come from very small changes in direction. The third mistake is forcing the fabric. You're guiding the fabric, but the machine should still be doing the work of pulling the fabric through. If you're pushing or shoving the fabric, you'll likely throw off the stitching. And the last one is watching the needle in the wrong way. You do want to be aware of where the needle is landing, but you don't need to stare at it going up and down. Your focus should be on where the stitch is forming in relation to your reference point. Now, while most problems come back to one of those, sometimes you sew the curve perfectly and it still comes out wonky. That's what we'll look at next. Sometimes you sew a curve really well, but when you flip it right side out, it won't stay flat. So, let's say you're sewing two layers together for a curved top flap of a purse. You sew the curve, turn it right side out, and the edge wants to pucker or pull instead of laying smoothly. This happens because the fabric on the inside of a tight curve doesn't have enough space to spread out. This is where things like notching or clipping the seam allowance come in. They give the fabric room to relax into the curve once sewn. So, what's notching or clipping? Notches are V-shaped cuts made into the seam allowance on curves to reduce bulk and help the fabric lay flat. Clipping is just cutting small snips into the seam allowance on inside curves. These don't have to be precise. With both notches and clipping, you just want to make sure not to cut into the stitching. I honestly don't use either of these very often in practical accessories, but it's good to know for those cases when the curve isn't behaving. In most of my everyday projects, I typically use an overedge stitch to enclose the raw edges of the fabric while stitching the layers together. But I can't use this with some tight curves because I can't clip into the stitches. So when I know I'll be sewing a tight curve, I'll switch to a regular straight stitch with a regular seam allowance, so I'll have room to add those little clips and let the fabric fan out. Now, if you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it. And if you want more foundational sewing skills, you can check out this playlist. Thanks for watching. Bye!